Grimwild is being promoted as a streamlined version of D&D or as a spiritual successor to Dungeon World, and I think both of these are incorrect. I do think that this is a very interesting game. I ran it a few times now, and the TLDR is that this is a great game for deeply narrative fantasy one-shots or very short campaigns, and while I don't think that it's quite as accessible as it wants to be, I do think it does a great job at taking familiar mechanics, especially if you're in the PBTA and Forged in the Dark world, and then just using them in really interesting ways. Welcome to Polyhedron, my name is Ron. Grimwild has a free edition which contains everything you need to play. It has pretty great VTT support and an active and welcoming Discord community. All of those things are incredibly valuable when you're learning a new game. I would argue that those things are often more valuable than the game itself and the mechanic itself. So right off the bat, the TLDR, I've already TLDR'd, but you know what I mean. It's a good game. You should try it. So the system itself is a mishmash of Forged in the Dark rules and classic PBTA rules and some new mechanics. It definitely draws some inspiration from Fate as well. If this is your first ever foray into these types of narrative chaos games and you've only ever played D&D, I do think you'll be jumping into the deep end here with Grimwild. You should still try it, but just know what you're walking into. But this game definitely assumes that at least someone at the table has played this type of game before. Actually, I can get my main criticism of this game out the way earlier. While I really enjoyed reading the rulebook, in its attempt to be very concise and clever, it's a little hard to understand what they're going for. So I just ended up reading it over and over again, but this was made better by the many gameplay examples in the book, which are all really good. But the way that the rules themselves are written, it assumes that you sort of already get it, that you get what the game is trying to be, which maybe you do and maybe you don't. And I've played a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games and Forged in the Dark game and, generally these deeply narrative games. And it still took me quite a while to get what this game is trying to do. And it also took me talking to some people on the Discord. I don't know, maybe for other people it clicks immediately. For me, it took a little while. The play examples, like I said, do go a long way and are very well done. The core mechanic of Grimwild is this. You roll d6s equal to the stat that you're testing, brawn, agility, wits, or presence, and all of them do exactly what you think they do. And you take the highest result to determine the outcome. A 6 is called a perfect, you do the thing successfully. 4 or 5 is a messy, you do the thing but with a complication. A 1, 2, or a 3 is a grim. You fail and something bad happens. If you've played Blades or any Forged in the Dark game, this is very familiar to you. A critical happens when you roll 2 or more 6s. A disaster happens when a grim result, so a 1, 2, or a 3, is reduced by something called a thorn. A thorn is one or two, specifically D8s, that your GM can add to your roll to represent the increased difficulty of something. And any 7 or 8 on those D8s cuts your roll's outcome by 1 step. I'm intentionally using the terminology that's in the book, but we'll get to that later. So as an example, your character tries to scale the castle wall. So your GM calls for an agility roll. You have 2 in agility, so you roll 2d6, but because you're scaling a wall while a pack of goblins is also chasing you and throwing spears at you, while the castle guard is shooting down crossbow bolts at you, and at the goblins or whatever, the GM adds a thorn to represent how difficult this task is. So you roll your 2d6 and your additional d8, and you get a 1 and a 3 on your d6s. So a grim result, since your highest die was a 3. But you also rolled that d8, which you rolled a 7. So the thorn reduces your result by 1 step. A perfect would go to a messy would go to a grim, and a grim would go to a disaster. So in this case, our result is a disaster. One of the bolts hits you on the shoulder, you fall off the castle wall into the goblin horde where they immediately start stabbing you with spears and eating you alive. This is a game that encourages big dramatic swings, and your table has to be ready for that. On the one hand, this can be really exciting and swingy. The book encourages the GM that a disaster, for example, like in our case, should be really catastrophic and even kill the character if it's appropriate narratively. That's why I would say that this game is great for one-shots, especially if you have a group that is very narratively focused, or is very used to games like D&D and could use like a big cinematic creative break. When I run long fantasy games in systems like D&D or my personal fantasy system of choice, 13th Age, and I have a session where not all the players can make it, for example, I like to run Origins one-shots where we explore something in the history, the past of the world that we're playing in. And I would usually run those in Dungeon World to keep things easy and relatively similar to, the main system. I would now consider running some of those in Grimwild, although Dungeon World, I would say, is still easier for D&D players to quickly pick up, and it accomplishes a lot of the same things, especially if you borrow a little bit from Grimwild. But Grimwild still is a pretty special game. The thing to remember about games like Grimwild is that while it can feel amazing to go through huge swings in the narrative so quickly, it can also be exhausting. I ran a few sessions of this game right after playing a ton of Ironsworn, which is one of my favorite games, but I was close to burning out on how swingy the game is and how almost every roll is basically a 50-50 coin flip if you really think about it. Don't get me wrong, these games usually create some of the wildest stories, and I've played multiple months-long campaigns in games like this, specifically, Ironsworn, Blades, and a bunch of other ones. I love them, and I really liked Grimwild too. My point is that your table needs to be ready for this style of play, but that's true for any game, just like they would need to be ready if you put Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in front of them. Okay, so let's talk about some of the cool things that this game does. By far, the coolest mechanic in this game is the diminishing dice pools. This is Grimwild's interpretation of clocks from Blades in the Dark. Let's say that you need a timer for a massive tsunami wave hitting the shore. And in Blades, you would create a clock and you would tick that clock as an outcome of a roll. In Grimwild, you create a pool of d6s. You roll that pool every time that a result calls for it. And then you drop every roll that was a 1, 2, or a 3. Until there are just no more dice in the pool. I think this is genius. This is the game intentionally leaning into the swingy narrative chaos concept. Maybe it takes forever for that wave to hit. Maybe it's right now. You can't know, so every roll matters. This is another mechanic that I think makes this game great for one-shots. Session after session, I can see how the pools can be exhausting because you could roll and roll and roll and the pool stays the same. So I can see the situation, I can see the scenario where you create a pool and all the players at the table are just like, ugh, because they know what's coming. But in one-shots, you go all out, you do crazy stuff, and the swingy nature of it can really be an advantage. And this game is wonderful for that. One of the coolest ways that this game uses the pools is in the monster design, which again, I think is brilliant. It's pretty easy to improvise any type of monster because in the end, it's just the players rolling. But the book offers some examples of how linked dice pools can represent an enemy. Here's a great example, and again, one of my favorite. I use this in all of the games that I ran. The Baelor. He has a 4D pool that represents the burning whip, which protects the head. That is also a pool of dice. So maybe you have to get rid of that pool before you can get to the head. I used this, and this was so much fun because it's one big monster, but it feels like a few fight scenes happening all at the same time, right? Because let's say that as a result of a successful roll, I roll on the dice pool representing the whip, and then let's say that dice pool diminishes to 0, so the Baelor loses the whip, and now the head is exposed, so you can start rolling on that. You can probably spend half your session doing a really exciting battle scene just on those alone. I also have to give them credit for the book itself. It's very well laid out, really easy to look up rules, and most importantly has a ton of examples, lots of play examples. Almost every rule comes with an example, which makes it a lot easier to learn. I will say it would have been easier to learn if the rules were a little bit clearer and they didn't assume so much about what you already get, and they do try to be really clever in the rules here. There are other games that I think do this better, but they have committed to a certain style of writing and they have made it better with the examples. I hope my point is getting across. And of course, like I said, it's free. It's a free book that feels like a premium product. I personally went ahead and bought the full book because I think it's worth it, and I think the people who made this deserve it, because it is very clear that this is a product made with love. This is a product made by people who love tabletop role-playing game. That's so clear reading this book. I ran this game both online on Foundry VTT and in person, and each time I also had to teach the game, and it ran pretty smoothly on all of these sessions. But I will note that all of these groups I ran this for were experienced role players who are very used to narrative games and Powered by the Apocalypse games and Forged in the Dark games. I don't know how well this game would work for a brand new group, but I don't think that that's really the audience that Grimwild is going for. I think they're going for the PBTA audience that feels that Dungeon World doesn't quite do what they want it to do, and it feels a little bit dated at this point, and they want a different, more cinematic fantasy game. I think that, like I said before, if this is your first tabletop RPG rulebook that you've ever read, you'll read it being like, what the fuck is happening? Like I mentioned, and I know I'm repeating myself at this point, they try to be really concise with the rules, which is both to their credit and detriment. They also try to be really clever. The book names everything. There's a vantage and a tangle and a suspense, and all these are these vague concepts that will totally make sense, sort of, if you've played a lot of these games. But some of the language here, I just wish it would have been more straightforward for what the game wants to be. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it is still the GM makes it up. A good example of this is comparing the random tables in Grimwild to Ironsworn, both of which give them cute names. Grimwild Crucibles and Ironsworn Oracles. The Ironsworn Oracles are very straightforward. This is a list of things that you might find on a pirate ship. The Grimwild Crucibles are meant to be more abstract and evocative, which, to their credit, they are, which sometimes is great, but sometimes it's just less useful at the moment, at the table. The bottom line is that Grimwild does what it sets out to do. It is an exciting, cinematic, deeply narrative experience. I will definitely use it again, specifically for fantasy one-shots, specifically for like high-powered fantasy one-shots. I don't think it's as easy to bring this to the table as the game hopes it will be. If you're bringing this to a D&D table, Dungeon World is still probably going to be less of a leap. But if you have the right table for it, Grimwild can be pretty amazing. Like I legitimately had a great experience running this game at multiple tables. And the community and support around it alone makes it worthwhile, both for the free edition and for the paid edition. Yeah, so for some engagement bait for you, have you run Grimwild? And if you haven't run Grimwild, what's your kind of one-shot machine game of choice? I actually legitimately would love to know, so leave me a comment.